Well, good evening and welcome to the Starting Point Project's live stream broadcast for October 2019. It has been quite a while since we did a program. We normally take the summer off, which we did, but then I got so busy I didn't have time to do a program last month. So we're doing one this month. It's going to be a good one, but it's new to all of us. It's been such a long time. What we always do is let you know when the next program is going to be. We picked the date, November 5th. So put that on your calendar, let other people know so you can join in. I'm not sure what the topic is going to be. If you know, let me know. But I haven't figured that out yet. We'll do November and December, some topics, and we'll probably start with the new series in January. We've had a lot going on. I always talk about our Grand Canyon tours. The next one we have scheduled is next May 28th through the 31st. If you're not familiar with them, we spend basically one day walking along the rim and then another day on the river, Colorado River, going around the famous Horseshoe Bend here. I've got some video footage that I've shown before. Last summer on one of my trips there, I went to the top of the rim where we go around on the raft at the bottom there. Went to the top, took some footage with my phone. It's just spectacular. If you haven't been to the Grand Canyon before, get a hold of us. The tour is about halfway filled already. It's filling up pretty early, pretty quick, but you can still get on that one if you're interested. And then we have something brand new. We've not done this before. We are doing a Mount St Helens tour next August 17th to the 21st. We are just starting to open up registration. We have most of the details. You can contact us at our website, but basically you're going to be giving multiple hikes and tours and talks with a number of scientists. Dr. Steve Austin is one of the main ones. He's done tons of research on Mount St. Helens. Fascinating tour. A lot of details about the volcano and how much catastrophe happened in a very short period of time. It actually ties into the flood, ties into the Grand Canyon. If you haven't been there before, it's an awesome trip. So get a hold of us if you're interested. This is what it looks like now when it's not erupting. But you can go to our website, thestartingpointproject.com, and you can get more information by contacting us, and we'll have registration up and running very, very shortly. Tonight's show, which is what you tuned in for, we are going to be discussing, should you confront your professor or teacher? This will work college or high school. The same principles apply. A lot of people wonder about this. Do you say something? Do you not say something? If you do, how do you do it? And how do you do it without getting pummeled? Because if you don't do it right, it could make things worse than if you hadn't said anything at all. So we're going to be going through this. This is brand new to me, too. I got a lot of thoughts that I wanted to convey, but didn't have a lot of time to go through the talk. So I put a bunch of PowerPoint together, and I'll be seeing this for the first time along with you. So here's an interesting quote. I share this in some of my talks. This is Dr. Richard Rorty from the University of Virginia. This kind of a quote will wake you up. He said, secular professors in the universities ought to arrange things so that students who enter as bigoted, homophobic, religious fundamentalists will leave college with views more like our own. Students are fortunate to find themselves under the benevolence of people like me and to have escaped the grip of their frightening, vicious, dangerous parents. We're going to go right on trying to discredit you parents in the eyes of your children, trying to strip your fundamentalist religious community of dignity, trying to make your views seem silly rather than discussable. And things like this are happening all across the country. State universities all over the place, even many public high schools, are direct attacks against Christianity. Many of our kids and grandchildren are not prepared for that, and many end up walking away from their faith, which we've discussed in past programs. Some statistics say 2/3 or more of youth from Christian homes walk away from their faith during their college years. A lot of factors going on behind it. It's not just apologetics, but the fact that they're not able to defend their views doesn't help at all. And again, many end up walking away. Some come back later, but some really, really struggle because of these attacks that they get. Well, we're going to look at some real life classroom situations, things that are actually going on, things that if you haven't experienced them already, you may in the near future. These are just a couple quick examples of friends of mine that shared, what their kids experienced, in high school and in college. So they get to the class, maybe it's the first semester of the school year, they're in class. One parent friend of mine told me that their child experienced this. The teacher said, "How many of you here are Christians?" Their son raised his hand along with a few others. And the teacher said, "Would you please get up and sit in the back of the room?" Wow, how humiliating and how wrong for a teacher to do that. And not all teachers would do this, probably very few, but this can happen, and it did happen. How do you respond? I'm sure his son, didn't know how to respond at the time, but it's just, again, very unfortunate. But these, again, are attacks against the Christian worldview. They would never do that with a Muslim or some other religion. Another question that came up, another friend of mine, their son or daughter, the question was, how many of you believe in God? Again, a number of students raised their hand, and then the teacher said, well, you won't by the end of the semester. Went on to say, well, it's my job to teach you real truth, to get you a real education, to live in the real world. So you can leave that Bible myth at home. I don't want to hear anything about it. Again, how intimidating for a teacher or professor, and how wrong to do that. But again, most students are not equipped to know how to respond, and they're a little bit young and maybe shy. I know I was really shy growing up. So again, these are some examples of things that are really going on. Again, now this isn't every day, every class, but these are things that our kids and grandchildren can experience. And maybe you yourself, if you're youth or in college right now. I will also share some of my own personal experiences because I learned a lot over the past, 33 years since I graduated from college. My geology professor at the State University, I'll be giving my background a little bit more in just a second, but when I was at the State University, my geology professor was very caustic towards Christians. I was studying to get my degree in physics, and I needed one more science class, and I could pick whatever I wanted. I thought, I'll pick geology. I didn't know much about geology. I thought I'll learn a little bit more about rocks and complete my degree. Well, the very first week of class, my professor was attacking the Bible, and that took me by surprise. I had just transferred to the university. I didn't know anyone else. I was in this class. I was in the second row. No one knew me. I didn't know them. The professor didn't know me or anything about me, but I'm sitting there. And he's making fun of the Bible, and the whole class is just laughing. He's a pretty interesting professor. The students seemed to really like him. But I felt so awkward with the whole class laughing at the Bible, him making fun of it. What would I say? I didn't know what to say. I was so shy. I didn't want to raise my hand, and I didn't want to be made fun of as well and be singled out in front of all the other students. So again, very awkward. This was before I really started getting into defending my faith. So again, I was at a point where I knew what I believed, but I didn't know why. So I was just very quiet and very embarrassed and didn't know what to say in response. A little bit further into the semester, the professor did find out who I was and that I was a Christian and believed in creation. We had a few conversations, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So at that point, he knew who I was, and he had pushed back against me a number of times. One day before class started, he's in the back talking with some students, and I'm sitting, towards the front there, and I had a newspaper article about Uluru, Ayers Rock in Australia. I'm not going to go into the details about this right now, but it's a very interesting geologic formation. I knew nothing about this. Seriously, it was just kind of an interesting thing. He's a geology professor. He could probably tell me about it. That's all I wanted to know. So as he's coming up from the back of the classroom, passing me, I just grabbed his attention and showed him the newspaper with a picture of this rock. I said, hey, you know anything about this? He started swearing at me very loudly, and all the other students were wondering, what in the world did I say to him to upset him? I hadn't said anything other than asked him, do you know anything about this rock? I wasn't trying to make a point. I didn't know anything about it. And so he was very upset, was swearing, and then went up to the front of the class and started teaching, again, giving the students the impression that I said something to tick him off when I really didn't. Even though he was upset, he shouldn't have been, and he didn't treat me very fairly, all because of him finding out that I was a Christian and had different views, even though I was very respectful in class. Then my physics professor, I had a number of physics professors, but my main professor, he and I had some discussions where he found out I was a Christian and believed in creation. And again, he was telling me I was wrong about everything that I believed. He would continually take shots at me in class. The other students didn't really know what was going on because they weren't in on our conversations, so they didn't know that there was any tension here. But he would take little shots at me. One time, I raised my hand and I said, hey, that exam that you just mentioned, is that next Tuesday or Wednesday? And then he was writing on the board. He goes, well, that'll be Wednesday. And then he turned around and goes, well, Lord willing, very sarcastic to me. Again, the students probably didn't pick up on that. Another time, I asked a question. He was talking about some velocity of a particle. And I just asked, is that an absolute velocity or a relative velocity? Because we were always talking about absolute and relative. And he said, well, it's got to be relative, because the only way you could have an absolute velocity is if there was a single point in the entire universe that everything was measured against, like, oh, I don't know, Mount Ararat, he said. Again, very sarcastic, dripping with sarcasm. Students did pick up on it, but I knew he was taking a shot at me. And one last one I remember is he was talking about the structure of the atom. And I knew that there's somewhat of an issue in the nucleus. You got neutrons and protons. Neutrons are neutrally charged. There's no charge to them. The protons are positively charged. Well, when you have similar charges next to each other, they repel. So why do the protons stay in the nucleus when they should be just repelling and flying out? Now, we don't really know. We got ideas, we make up forces that might be there doing whatever, but ultimately, I'm not really quite sure. And I knew that, and I just kind of wanted the class to be aware that we don't really know why that is. So I raised my hand and I just said, hey, if the protons are all positively charged, why do they stay in the nucleus like they do? And he was writing on the board again. He turned around, he goes, I don't know. It's just the way the good Lord made it. Again, but very sarcastic. And so throughout the semester, he would take shots at me that way. I actually had a fair amount of respect for him because I thought he was a pretty cool professor, very smart, even though he's taking shots at me. We had a pretty good rapport, unlike myself and some of my other professors. And in fact, I just today looked up his name on the internet. He's still around. He's 91 years old. I really feel like I'd like to reach out to him if I can find out, where he's living. Because again, I had somewhat of a friendship with him, even though we had very, very different views. Some other real life classroom situations. This is one that my daughter experienced when she was a freshman in high school. She just got married a couple months ago. But when she was a freshman in high school, she took biology. And the first day of class, her teacher, who was very intimidating, said that the church is against science. Now, if I was in that public high school and said anything about church, they'd kick me out. But here's the biology teacher talking about church in his class, saying the church is against science. And my daughter, who I had told, I said, when you take biology, just be respectful, get a good grade, and be a good testimony. Don't feel like you need to debate the teacher. I will decide if God wants me to do anything, to be involved in any way, but you just, no pressure. I didn't want her to feel like, well, my dad expects me to go in and debate the teacher. So all the pressure was off, but she was 14 years old. And on her own, when the teacher said the church is against science, she raised her hand. He didn't know who she was, just called on her. She said, the church isn't against science, it's against some scientists' opinions. And he kind of nodding his head like, okay, good point. Like, wow, that's true. That's pretty wise coming from a 14-year-old, high school student. But there are a lot of other examples I could share that how my daughter responded in school, which made me very proud of her because she did it very respectfully and she really kind of knew what she was talking about. But again, there was an example of a teacher attacking at least, the church in some generic sense of Christianity, religion in general, and biology. Well, why can't you just teach biology? But he felt like he had to go out of his way and say something negative towards Christianity or the church or whatever, where if you say something positive about it, they say, no, you can't do that in the school system, separation of church and state. Then we have a state university situation. I was speaking on campus at a state university, and one of the students said that in their biology class, they had one class coming up in the near future that was entitled Problems with Creation, creationism, which I don't like that phrase ism, makes it sound like a disease. But I thought, wow, that sounds like an interesting class. I'd love to sit in on that. I asked her, could you talk to your professor and see if it's okay if I sit in on the class? She said, sure. She got back to me and he said, yeah. I was shocked. So I showed up at the university and I told her, I said, I'm not planning on saying anything. I just want to listen. I don't want to disrupt. It's not my class. It's not my place. I just kind of want to hear what's being presented. And then I said, what did you say to him to get his permission? I'm surprised. And she said, I just told him that I know someone who's interested in the topic. Could he sit in? And I said, that's good. That's wise. Because if he knew I was a creationist, he probably wouldn't want me sitting there. So I went in and sat in the class. And I wish I had more time to talk about the whole thing. But it was very, very sad, for a number of points, which I'll bring up here. During the class, he said, today we're going to talk about the idea of creationism and all the problems that are, associated with it. And then he asked the class, can anyone think of any origins accounts in the Bible? And so someone raised their hand. They said, origin of the universe. He said, yep. And he turns around and he writes on the board, origin of the universe. And he said, any other origins accounts? And I wasn't quite sure where he was headed with that. And then someone else said, origin of life. And he said, well, yeah, we're going to lump that in, though, with the origin of the universe and origin of life. Then I really started wondering, where else is he heading with this? And the students couldn't think of anything. And then he said, what about the origin of language? And I thought, yeah, that's an origin account in the Bible. The Bible talks about the origin of the different languages we have, Tower of Babel and all that. So he writes that on the board. He says the Bible talks about the origin of languages. And he went through that a little bit, skipped that one for now. Then he said, any other origins accounts? And I really didn't know what he'd be thinking of next. But then he said, how about the origin of pain in childbirth? I thought, yeah, that's another origin account. The Bible talks about why there's pain in childbirth because of Adam and Eve's sin. So he writes that on the board, and then he turns around to the class and he says, how many of you here actually believe the reason we have pain in childbirth is because Eve sinned in that garden? And I thought, wow, really putting the students on the spot, picking, pointing out Christianity and kind of bashing it. So I didn't know how I was going to respond because I certainly believe that that's true, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Oh, the girl who invited me to come to the class was sitting next to me. Her hand went up, and I looked around, and about 3 other hands in the back went up. And I just felt I have to raise my hand. If I don't, it'll look like I don't believe that. So I raised my hand, hoping that he wouldn't call on me because I really didn't want to disrupt him. I could have shared tons of things. It just would not have been appropriate. So he didn't call on me, but he said, look around. There are actually people who believe that. And he's laughing. And then he goes on with the class. And a lot of other things were not good that happened in that class, but it just made me sick to my stomach. Not just for these students here that were humiliated and didn't know how to respond and were being made fun of, but knowing that that happens in high school classes and state universities all across the country every day. And it really can't be stopped. There's nothing we can do to just magically stop it. So I really felt for these students and others who go through that. So again, these are just a few examples of things that we see going on. And I could name many, many more. Another experience that I had at the State University was my sociology professor. I needed one more, class of 3 credits or something to graduate. I picked it was a general ed requirement, so pick sociology. So I'm sitting through the class, not all that interested. At one point, he brings up a social issue of capital punishment. And so he puts capital punishment on the board. And then he said, let's think of all the pros and cons to capital punishment. And so the students were raising their hand, throwing things out. So we had a big, graph on the board. One side would be pros, the other side would be cons. At one point, someone said, well, the Bible says an eye for an eye. He goes, yep, it does. So that's a pro. The Bible is for capital punishment, eye for eye. And someone else raised their hand right after that, said, yeah, but Jesus said turn the other cheek, so we shouldn't do that. So he goes, you're right. The Bible says we shouldn't do that. And he puts it up there. And then I was just feeling really awkward thinking they just made it look like the Bible contradicts itself and you can go both ways and all this. I didn't really know everything the Bible had to say about capital punishment, but I knew it wouldn't contradict itself. So I went to the professor afterwards and I said, you know what? The Bible doesn't contradict itself. I believe it is for the whole idea of capital punishment. I said, you might want to mention that so the students don't think it's contradicting itself. He goes, you know what? Why don't you tell the class that, tomorrow, when you bring in something, I'll let you come up here and talk. And I was extremely shy, did not want to do that. And I don't even remember any details other than I quick contacted my pastor, got some verses. And the next day I went back to class and I had to get up there and tell them what the Bible had to say about capital punishment, which was probably good. I was able to, but man, was I nervous, so nervous that I don't really remember. It was just kind of a fog from back then because I was so shy, but I at least wanted to say something to the professor. But again, another classroom to make Christianity look weak. Now, newsflash about your teachers and professors. Number one, most of them are very nice people. So this show is not about bashing teachers in public school systems or professors at the state universities. Most of them are very nice people. Certainly are exceptions, but most of them are very nice. Most of them are also only teaching the only thing they've ever learned or heard. They went mostly to the public school system. They decided they wanted to be a teacher, professor. They get their degrees, they go back and they teach, and they're teaching the same thing they learned when they were there. They're not trying to lie to the students. Unfortunately, a lot of what they teach is not true, but they're not advertently lying. They are teaching what they actually believe is true. They're very sincere. They think it's true, so that's what they're teaching. Also, a lot of them have stereotypes in their minds about Christianity and the Bible and religion in general. They have all these ideas of what it's about, so when they meet a student who claims to be a Christian, or the topic of the Bible comes up, or religion in general, they have all these typically negative stereotypes about it, and so they're not going to be as receptive towards it, and they're going to attack it from angles that maybe aren't legitimate, what we call strawman, where you claim that your opponent believes something they don't, and then you tear it down very easily. Well, it's not what they believe to begin with. So they have a lot of ideas about Christianity that are not true, and it causes them to doubt it, reject it, and to bash it. So again, many of them are coming from that standpoint where they don't really truly understand it. Most of them have an opinion of the Bible based not on their own studying, but just based on what someone else told them. Somebody else told them it's filled with errors and contradictions. There are missing portions, extra stuff that got shoved in there. There's all these different versions that it contradicts itself, and it's been disproved by science, and on and on and on. And so, yeah, they're not too big about the Bible because of what they supposedly know. Well, again, it's not what they know. It's just someone else told them that, and they assume that it's true. Also, most of them cannot really defend their own beliefs. Not very well at all. We assume they can. Most of them, they've read something in a book, it sounds good to them, and it just becomes true. In their mind, it's a fact. But when you ask them further questions about it, you find out, yeah, they have beliefs, but there's really almost nothing to back it up. Once in a while, a few things, but a lot of areas, there is literally nothing other than that's what they've been taught, and no one really questions them. And so don't make the assumption that they're experts in that area and they really truly know. My experience, which you'll find out shortly, is I found out that my professors really didn't know. And they're not used to being challenged. You got to understand that too. Their job is to go into school, into the university, and conduct their classes, open up the textbooks, go through the content, grade papers, and go home. They're not in there to have a debate every day. And it shouldn't be a debate every day, but they should be prepared for questions and some challenges. But they're not used to that. So when it happens, it's very awkward for them, especially in front of all the other students. They don't want to be wrong or embarrassed or humiliated in front of the other students. Who would? I wouldn't want to be. If I didn't know much about Christianity, but I believed it, someone started pummeling me with questions around my friends, I'd be pretty embarrassed and would want to get out of that situation and might even push back against the other person. So that's what we see quite often because, again, they're not used to being in that situation. Again, more my own personal story. At the State University, studying physics. Again, I had started out at the Christian University doing engineering, got the degree there, but then transferred to the State University for physics. And then getting there, again, all my professors were telling me I was wrong about everything that I believed. And I realized that I knew what I believed, but I didn't know why. I could not defend my beliefs. So now here I am. It's the backdrop at the State University. Being very uncomfortable, being a fish out of water, hardly having any other Christians around me other than I got involved in the Navigators group, which really helped me personally grow and have some friends and encouragement. But most of the students I was around in my classes and all my professors were adamantly against me, against my views, my Christian views, and tell me I was wrong about everything. That's where God put it on my heart to start looking into these things and studying. So again, I've been researching and speaking now for 33 years on these topics. But this takes us back to 33 years ago when I got started, in studying physics there. The very first lecture I ever gave, which I probably wouldn't want to watch it if it was recorded. I can't imagine it being very good. First lecture I ever gave, I was still super shy, Didn't know much about what I believed. I literally just started doing some research. My first lecture was to the physics club. And I highly do not recommend joining the physics club. It's pretty boring. If you're in physics, yeah, you probably got to do it. But I was part of the physics club. And one of the requirements they had was you had to do a little research and give a talk on some topic related to physics. Generally, the talks were 5-10 minutes long. They'd take one question and we'd leave. Not very exciting. So I thought, well, what am I going to do for a talk? Initially, I thought, I'll do something on lasers. I just was reading about lasers. I thought they were kind of cool. And I felt God telling me, no, don't do lasers. It's lame. Do scientific evidence for creation. And I remember thinking, you got to be kidding me. I just started researching this. I don't know that much yet. This is in front of my professors and other students. And I felt God saying, yeah, this is what I want you to do. So that's what I had to do. So did as much research as I could in a short period of time, put a talk together. It ended up being an hour long. And I talked 50 million miles an hour, but I stuck to science. I told them ahead of time, we are not here to talk about religion or God or the Bible. I said, I'd love to talk to you about those things later, but for this physics club talk, it's going to be about science. So I don't want anyone coming up afterwards and saying that was just a religious presentation. So that was my first lecture ever. And the backdrop, there's tons of stories that I could share with this, but what I want to get at for this particular broadcast is that in preparation for this talk, I realized if I give a talk on scientific evidence for creation and I don't address the best evidence for evolution, my professors could say, yeah, nice talk, but you didn't even address our best evidence. But I didn't know what the best evidence was because I didn't believe in evolution. So I went to my main physics professor that I had a pretty good rapport with. And I went to his office and I said, hey, what are the best evidences for evolution? He said, I don't know. I said, what do you mean you don't know? I said, you believe in evolution, don't you? And he said, yeah. But you don't know any of the evidence? He goes, no. I said, that doesn't make any sense to me. And I said it very respectfully. I didn't get it. He's a PhD scientist. He believes evolution is an absolute fact, but he didn't know any evidence. I thought, okay. So then I went to my geology professor. Again, he and I already had a few conversations, and he was really pushing evolution in his class. So I went to his office and I asked him the same question. Hey, what are the best evidences for evolution? He goes, I don't know. Go ask the biology professors. They really teach that. Again, I was disappointed. He's teaching it in his class, but he won't share any evidences. So I went to the biology department. I didn't have biology at that state university, but I found the department. I was literally roaming the halls trying to find a professor. One of them saw me. He approached me, said, can I help you? And I said, yeah, I'm trying to find out what the best evidences are for evolution. And he said, I don't really know, but there are some other professors down the hall. Maybe they could help you. And I thought, well, at least he's being nice. We go down the hall. There's a door open to an office. 2 other professors are sitting at their desk working on something. He knocks on the side of the door. They turn around. They said, can we help you? And he said, yeah, this young man is trying to find out what the best evidences are for evolution. And they instantly said, why do you want to know? They got defensive. They didn't know me from Adam. And then I just said, well, I'm giving a talk on evolution and creation and just trying to find out what the best evidences are for evolution. I didn't even tell them I was a creationist. I just said I'm giving a talk on these 2 topics. They instantly started arguing with me. It didn't take long for them to figure out that I didn't believe in evolution, that I was a creationist, which angered them even more. At one point, I turned back to the professor who brought me there. When I turned back again, the other 2 professors went back to working on what they were doing when we showed up. So the professor at the door said, can you at least answer his question? And I will never forget, they turned around and they said, we have nothing more to say to you. That was it. I walked out in shock and confused. I was expecting them to say, we are really busy right now doing something, but maybe we can tell you 1 or 2, and then maybe you could schedule a time to come back and we could talk further. No, they didn't give me any evidence. They just got upset and they wouldn't talk to me anymore. Now, since then, I've learned a lot, and I kind of understand that response because many people who believe in evolution, again, can't defend it. They just assume it's been proven, and there are people out there who study it and know it, but they themselves just take comfort that it's done deal, it's settled science. And and you don't need to say anything because it's so obvious. And they come across making intimidating statements like that. So again, that was just one experience out of many, many that I had throughout my years at the State University. Now, here's how to not confront your teacher or professor. This is not rocket science at all. Pretty straightforward, but I just want to take a few minutes to mention these points. First, don't do it in an interrupting way. When you're in class, to interrupt inappropriately, that's not going to help. Don't be rude. You never want to be rude, so why would you be rude when you're trying to talk to your teacher or professor? Don't be arrogant, condescending in confronting them or saying whatever you want to say, asking a question or making your point. Don't need to be angry. You might actually feel angry for some reason, but you don't need to show that when you're addressing your professor or teacher. And then don't be distracting. Don't do it to draw attention to yourself, in a very disruptive way again in the classroom. Those aren't going to help in any way at all. This is how to do it. Number one, you want to be very respectful with whatever your point is going to be. Be very sincere. You just really want to know. Be timely. Do it in a very timely fashion. If the professor or teacher's in a hurry to finish class or whatever, that might not be the best time to do it. Be semi-prepared. If you're going to say something or ask something, be prepared for follow-up questions or to know a little bit more about whatever point you might be making. And then overall, be Holy Spirit-led. Again, that's going to help you be very gracious and very sincere with your questions rather than doing it out of your own flesh. Here's my advice for confronting teacher or professor. Not during class, other than just asking a question for clarification on something, but don't try to make a major point during class. Again, it could be disruptive. The teacher professor probably isn't going to really have time to address it appropriately. And again, you've got the whole student thing going on, and the professor wants to maintain good face here to not look bad in front of the students here. So again, it just isn't the best scenario to do that in class. I would suggest making an appointment with the professor or teacher. It doesn't have to be in their office, could be in the classroom, but do it outside of class saying, hey, do you have a few minutes if I stop by your desk here in the class or in your office? I have a few questions about some things that I need some better understanding about. So again, make an appointment. That would work a lot better. Bring someone with you. I highly recommend that, not necessarily this guy here. Bring someone with you for a couple reasons. One, the teacher or professor will probably respond a little bit more professionally when there's someone else there, because number two, they are a witness to see what's happening. You go by yourself and it could potentially come back to haunt you. The teacher or professor could claim you were screaming at them, that you pushed them or whatever. And how do you prove you didn't? When you have a second person there, it really helps. There was a witness there. And again, those things probably won't happen when you have someone there with you that can also help clarify things and back up your testimony if things get out of hand for some reason later. Second thing here is show appreciation. You come to their office or them after class at their desk or whatever, just say, hey, I really appreciate you taking time to help me out, because they're busy. And so they are taking time to do this. So tell them that you're thankful for that. You're appreciative that they're going to help you understand something better that they're teaching. The teacher or professor should like that you really want to learn this. Most students just want to do the minimum and then they're out of there. So at that point, you're showing you're trying to learn more and that you respect the fact that they're in a position, hopefully, to be able to help you. Again, be prepared. Know what it is specifically that you're going to ask. So if they ask you anything else about it, you can say a little bit more. And then stay focused. What do I mean by that? You go in there to ask about a specific topic. Very well could be the teacher, professor changes the subject. You bring something up that's challenging to them. One of the knee-jerk reactions is to bring up something else or a slew of other things. And before you know it, you're just backed into a corner and they are all over you with all these things that you were not expecting. You just went in to ask one thing and all of a sudden you regret you even showed up. So if they do start doing that, just say, hold on a second. I came in to ask you about this. I'm not quite sure why you're bringing everything else up. If you really feel you need to talk about that, can we do that some other time? But this is the one thing that I really want to understand better. So be prepared to do that in a very calm fashion, knowing that they can get you off of focus and off track very, very, very quickly. Here's some other advice on exams. You're in class, you got a test that comes up. How do you respond on an exam? There's a right way and a wrong way. The wrong way would be this. Let's say you're taking an exam, has something to do with the origin of the universe and origin of life or whatever. And the question is, how many years ago did dead chemicals come together to form a living cell? The wrong thing would be to say 0 years because it didn't happen that way because God created everything. The Bible is true and evolution's wrong. And it's like, okay, you're going to get the question marked wrong. You're not going to have time to finish the test, and you're going to annoy the teacher or professor. So that's really not the best way to handle it. The best way would be to write, according to the textbook, 3.8 billion years ago. You're not saying you believe it. You're saying according to the textbook. You're not being disrespectful. You're showing that you were paying attention, and that would be marked correct according to what's being taught in class. So that's a way of getting a good grade on the exam and showing the teacher some respect and that you're actually paying attention versus just trying to get your point across in an exam, which again isn't the appropriate place to do that anyway. Suggestion for the beginning of the semester, what you could do, talk to the teacher or professor and say, hey, I'm very aware that you're going to be teaching evolution in this class, whatever the topic would be. Let's just say evolution. I'm aware that you're going to be teaching evolution in this class. I don't necessarily believe everything about evolution, but I understand that's what you're teaching, and I just want you to know that. That way, when the test comes up, the teacher, professor already knows you don't believe these things. You don't have to make a point on each question. They know that. You're just showing that you've been paying attention. You can tell the professor, the teacher, that I know you're teaching it, and I don't necessarily accept it, but I want to learn as much as I can about it so I have a better understanding. I told both of our kids, I want them to know more about evolution than anyone else. I want them to understand what it supposedly represents. They will also know the problems with it too. I don't want to shelter them from it. So again, this would be a good approach. That way it takes off the pressure, from the rest of the semester. You made your point. You don't need to necessarily say anything else. So the important point here, it's not your responsibility for the outcome of any of these confrontations that you have, as long as you're not being, mean about it, disrespectful or anything. If you're simply approaching your teacher, professor, to get clarification, to understand it better, or to maybe present information that they didn't know, which we didn't have time to cover here, it's not your responsibility how they respond. You're just responsible for what you're sharing and how you share it. You want to maintain a good Christian testimony. So if you ever actually have an opportunity to share the gospel, they can see that that's consistent with how you've conducted yourself rather than you've been such a pain to them the whole semester. And now you want them to listen to some Jesus stuff. It doesn't work very well. Wish we had more time to talk about advice in how to ask questions, to go deeper with a professor rather than just having to prove your point all the time, how to get better at asking questions. Maybe that's a good topic for next month, since I haven't decided that yet. We could review some of this and cover some of that. One of the last points I'm going to make here, food for thought. This is something I'll never forget. When I was at the Christian college, the guy in the dorm room next to me had a big poster in his room of an athletic track and field thing, and there were runners running around the track. And at the top of that poster, it said, if once in a while during your life you don't run into Satan, chances are you go in the same direction. And that was very powerful to me, to picture runners going around. And if you're just going around through life and you're having a good time, really not having any problems, maybe you're not quite doing what God wants you to do, because if you're doing what he's called you to do, you're going to run into opposition over and over. Not just from teachers and professors, but from friends and just about everywhere you go. So be prepared. Expect that you're going to run into this opposition when you really are taking a stand for what you believe. And we should be taking a stand. We should be very evangelistic, telling the world around us the truth of the gospel message, whether they believe it or not. Again, it's not our job to twist their arm. We just are here to share the truth. The Holy Spirit does all the conviction. So be prepared that you're going to run into these times. Don't spend your whole high school or college career trying to avoid these things. It's not what God wants you to do. If I had done that, I wouldn't be doing this program today. I'd be probably a greeter at Walmart or something. Who knows? But because I took a stand, I got beat up. And because I got beat up, I got stronger in my faith year after year after year. And now I'm in a better position to be able to share it. but that's because I got beat up along the way. And God uses that process to strengthen your faith. It can be very, very productive. So, should you confront your professor? Yeah, you can if you do it appropriately, as we've discussed here. Don't forget our Grand Canyon tour. It is filling up fast, May 28th through the 31st. And then we also got the Mount St. Helens thing next August. Again, get a hold of us through our website, startingpointproject.com, to contact us to get a little bit more information and register soon. We're going to do now what we usually do, take a very short break. And when we come back from the break, we will be addressing your questions, which is my favorite part. We'll see you in just a minute. We are back, and we are going to be taking your questions. I've been told by the producers we have time for like 2 questions, which is fine. Again, this is my favorite part, so we'll start with the first question, which is from Dwight. It said, I've seen all sorts of fossils, but do not recall seeing human fossils alongside them. Do they exist, since only Noah and his family lived through the flood? Great question. There's a lot here, a lot of different directions we could go with this. And so what I think I'll do is give you kind of a big picture of the fossil record. When you think of the fossil record, you basically think of that maybe geologic column in the textbooks, all the layers in the earth. The layer is filled with sedimentary layers, the earth. And sedimentary layers are laid down basically catastrophically by water. These layers contain literally billions and billions of fossils. What is a fossil? Fossils are remain of a dead thing. So creatures got buried in the past and died, and then they got preserved. The only way you get a fossil is to bury it rapidly. If a cow dies in the field, animals will eat the meat, the bones will rot away. It'll be completely gone in the future. But if it gets buried rapidly, it gets preserved from the Earth's atmosphere, specifically oxygen, and then it can fossilize. So when you look at all these sedimentary layers in the earth, they say from the bottom, you've got this thing called the Great Unconformity, where basically granite rock below that, and all of a sudden you got all these sedimentary layers on top. That's actually where the flood would have started. But secular geologists will say that represents maybe 600 million years of Earth history of slow natural processes going on, forming these layers and all that. Well, what we see in these layers are the fossils. That's why we call it the fossil record. 95% of all these fossils are marine invertebrates, sea creatures that don't have skeletons. Only 5% are not. Probably about 95% of the 5% are like plants and things like that. A very, very small percentage are actually vertebrates, like bears or cats or mice or people. It's a very, very small percentage. What we see in this fossil record does not represent slow, gradual evolution over millions and millions of years. It represents where creatures are living when the flood occurred. If it was evolution, you'd see slow changes from bottom to top. We don't see that. We see basically 2 major features in the fossil record, even according to Stephen Jay Gould. He was one of the world's leading evolutionists. He said you see 2 things. You see something called abrupt appearance and stasis. Abrupt appearance means coming out of nowhere abruptly, fully formed. So when they see something, it's not slowly developing from something else. It's the first time they see it, it's fully formed already, like the trilobite down in like the Cambrian. It's got the most complex eye known to man, but it's in the Cambrian, one of the lowest layers And it comes out of nowhere fully formed. It's not like below that, oh, here's half that eye, here's 3/4 of that. No, fully formed right from the get-go. That was abrupt appearance. Secondly is stasis. Stasis means staying the same. So when they see these fossils, the trilobites or something else in higher layers, they're not really changing. Well, that's not evolution where they're fully formed the first time you see them and they don't change. That represents, again, the flood narrative, where creatures are living. Sea creatures get buried first because they're in the seas. So you got sediments coming into the oceans, burying things. They're not going anywhere. They're not going to run away from the flood. You got other creatures that are more mobile. So they're moving to higher and higher ground as the seawaters and floodwaters are rising. Eventually they go as high as they can. They can't get any higher. The water keeps coming. They drown. Their bodies decompose. They're completely gone. If, however, they were buried locally in a landslide or something during the flood, they could get preserved and turned into a fossil. So it's very rare that we see a fossil of a bear or a person or a monkey or a rat or, vertebrates like that. So it's a very small percentage. Plus, you don't see those fossils with the starfish and other creatures because they weren't living in the same area when the flood came. So you typically see them where they were living at the time the flood came. So almost all the fossils we see were created during the flood, about 4,500 years ago. We don't see things fossilizing today because we don't see the same processes going on. Occasionally, you might have a local catastrophe that would bury something that could potentially get fossilized. But largely today, we don't see things being fossilized. So we don't necessarily expect to see a lot of human fossils at all to begin with, and then we don't see them alongside of things that they weren't living with when the flood came. Also, with Noah and his family, the biblical narrative has a flood occurring. It's rounded off 4,500 years ago. They're coming off the ark. You got Noah and his wife, 3 sons and their wives, so 8 people. The Bible says that Noah and his wife didn't have any more kids after the flood. So it's just the 3 sons and the 3 wives repopulating the earth. There's so much evidence for that, even genetically. In fact, one study showed that when you look at genetics of people all over the planet today, you could kind of group them into 3 groups. Well, that very well could be because you had 3 couples coming off the ark. And the Bible tells us about Ham, Shem, and Japheth and their offspring and where they went on the earth. It explains the different people groups we have, not the races. There aren't races. There's one race, the human race. The book of Acts says we're all of one blood. But it does explain the different people groups. You got the story of the Tower of Babel, how they were dispersed that way. It explains an awful lot. So Noah and his family would have populated the earth, but we don't expect their descendants to fossilize because they weren't getting buried in a worldwide flood. So that kind of addresses that. There are a lot of other things we could say, but we got to move on to our second and last question for this broadcast. Herbie from Minnesota. Secular geologists have their ideas about how the Great Lakes were created by glacier action. How would you explain this from a creationist viewpoint? I like this question because it allows me to make a larger point, and that is very often creationists and evolutionists, and when I say that, I got to be careful because there are a number of religious people and even Christians who believe in evolution. So what I really mean is those who believe in a 6-day creation account and those who don't, who believe in some scenario that involves millions and billions of years and maybe the Big Bang and maybe even evolution. The differences between these 2 groups is often not really the process or what happened, it's the time scale. For example, plate tectonics. All the scientists that I know believe that there used to be one large continent that was broken up into the continents we have today. Talk about Pangea. It's not just an evolutionary idea. I believe that, yes, that one large landmass was broken up into the continents today. The difference is timing. Secular scientists talk about that landmass breaking up slowly over millions and millions and millions and millions of years, called a continental drift, slowly moving apart. Well, there's really no physical mechanism that could do that. Creationists, 6-day creationists, would believe that that landmass was broken up catastrophically during the year of the flood. And there are forces that could do that, and there's evidence that what happened. Dr. John Baumgartner, PhD geophysicist, he's built the world's best 3D computer simulation of plate tectonics. His model shows how these plates of the Earth, once they start moving, they go with subduction, go faster and faster, and they call it runaway subduction. They could be moving up to meters per second. Plates of the Earth moving meters per second during the flood. So you got that landmass being torn apart, broken up into the continents we see today in a short period of time. So one landmass broken up into continents, but over different time periods. So with this case, we're talking about glaciers tied into the Ice Age. All scientists I know believe in an Ice Age. The difference is the timing. Secular scientists and geologists will talk about ice ages happening hundreds of thousands and millions of years ago, and actually multiple ice ages, whereas biblical creationists talk about a single ice age that was actually triggered by the flood. Secular geologists kind of have a challenge on their hands explaining how an ice age occurs. They typically talk about the Earth cooling down over time. That won't cause an ice age. If the Earth cools down, the oceans cool down. If the oceans cool down, you don't get enough evaporation to come down as precipitation as snow to make ice sheets. But the flood narrative would give you a perfect scenario for an ice age. The initiation of the flood, the great fountains of the deep are opened up. Within the oceans, you got magma shooting up into the oceans. Hot steam blasts going up into the atmosphere, coming back down as torrential rains for 40 days and 40 nights. It wasn't just that it rained from some clouds for 40 days and 40 nights. The great fountains of the deep are opened up first. The oceans are warming up because of the magma, because of plate tectonics. But then you got volcanoes also going off on land, putting a lot of debris and soot up into the atmosphere, blocking out sunlight. So while the volcanoes and magma and plate tectonics are greatly warming up the oceans, the volcanoes going off on land are blocking out sunlight and the land masses are cooling down. But with the warmer oceans, you got more evaporation than normal that then comes back down as precipitation in the form of snow, forming ice sheets. And then even when the summer comes, it's not as warm as normal because there's not as much sunlight coming through. So the ice sheets that have built up don't melt back much, if at all. And then the next winter, they pile up more and more, so they keep accumulating over time. Eventually, the oceans cool back down again. The debris in the atmosphere settles out. Sunlight's coming through, and the ice sheets that did build up melt back. So that ice age causes glaciers, which have come down northern United States. I live in Wisconsin. We have a lot of evidence of glaciers from different formations of drumlins and kettles and moraines and things like that. There's a lot of evidence there were glaciers here. It was caused by the ice age, it was triggered by the flood, and then it has melted back. So they form different pockets and things, and they melt back, and then you have Great Lakes, and some of them are supplied by springs and all that. So we don't necessarily disagree about how these things were formed, except for time frames. And in this case, we also believe the flood triggered that. So we don't necessarily have to disagree with what we're actually observing in the real world. We just have a different interpretation of how it happened. And the more we look at the detailed science, the more it seems to back up the biblical narrative over and over and over. So the Bible gives us a great framework to understand science like geology and ice ages and things like that. So again, great question. It brings us to the end of our broadcast. Just another reminder, our next broadcast is going to be November 5th. Probably going to be talking a little bit more about how to have these confrontations with professors and teachers, and it can apply to skeptics too. It doesn't necessarily have to be in an educational setting. So hopefully it'll be very practical for you. We look forward to seeing you next month. God bless.